On Susquehanna's side, fair Wyoming, although the wildflower on thy ruined wall and roofless homes a sad remembrance bring of what thy gentle people did befall, yet thou wert once the loveliest land of all, that seed the Atlantic wave their morn restore. Sweet land, may I thy lost delights recall, and paint thy Gertrude in her bowers of yore, whose beauty was the love of Pennsylvania's shore. It's kind of wild when you think about it, that this could be the site of a Revolutionary War battle that nobody knows about. On the right side as you drive into West Nanticoke, a rock cropping emerges from the hills. This was one of 3 battles that decided the fate of Pennsylvania today. Almost 300 years ago, the United States of America earned its independence as a nation. The Revolutionary War, the battle between what was then the British colonies in the New World and the British monarch, George III, was fought in the new colonies up and down the Atlantic coast to decide who controlled the country. Although a few incidents beforehand, like the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, and civil unrest caused by legislation like the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, Lexington and Concord, and the Coercive Acts, amped up the bad blood between the colonists and the British government, the Revolutionary War officially began on April 19, 1774, and ended on September 3, 1783. The war was won by America, and a new government was formed in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. First, with the signing of the Declaration of Independence right in the middle of the war, and then the crafting of the Constitution after the war had officially ended. But if it weren't for the Pennamite Yankee Wars, a series of 3 wars that occurred both before and during the Revolutionary War, right here in the Wyoming Valley, today's Pennsylvanians might be calling themselves Connecticuters. Pennsylvania's charter, granted to William Penn by the British King Charles II, had fluid boundaries. Over the years, however, those boundaries were firmed up. To the east, toward what is today New Jersey, the border was the Delaware River. To the south, the boundary line between Pennsylvania and Delaware was mapped out in the 12-mile circle by Philadelphia astronomer David Rittenhouse. Although Newcastle was supposed to be at the center of the circle, the city and Philadelphia ended up in Maryland. The Crown had to step in after a conflict known as Cresap's War to settle the boundary line at 39 degrees 43 minutes north instead of a clean 40 degrees north latitude. Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon took over the boundary drawing and created the Mason-Dixon line between 1764 and 1768 to separate Pennsylvania and Maryland. The land between Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Virginia were to be decided after the war, and in 1774, Pennsylvania and New York agreed to a 42-degree north latitude border. The issue, however, lay with Pennsylvania's border to Connecticut. Connecticut's border was very vague and allowed Connecticut to claim any territory it wanted to the west. When the state, which had already pushed its boundary line into New York, began overflowing with people, it needed to expand once more into Pennsylvania. The Connecticuters eyed a small scrap of territory in northeastern Pennsylvania, or what is today known as the Wyoming Valley, as its new settlement. The Pennamite Yankee Wars began with this land dispute. The Connecticuters, or Yankees, took advantage of their vague charter and pushed into the Wyoming Valley. This, Pennsylvania claimed, violated its charter because the Penns claimed the territory fell within its boundaries. The Penns had also been reserving that land for the displaced Native American tribes, which double-crossed the Penns. The Iroquois Confederacy sold the land to the Penns, but a second group of Iroquois had also sold the land to the Delaware and Susquehanna companies, which, in turn, sold the land to the Yankees. To settle it a second time, the two states began arguing charter timing. After the Penn signed another treaty with the Native Americans at the conclusion of the French and Indian War, adding a new purchase to lay claim to all land within its chartered borders, the Susquehanna Company in Connecticut, the Yankees, declared the purchase invalid and sent men to reclaim the land and people to settle the land as a Connecticut territory. To beat the company to the punch, the Penns broke up the land and gave it in small grants to people on the condition that they protect the land from intruders. This marked the beginning of the Yankee-Pennamite Wars. The First Pennamite-Yankee War took place from 1769 to 1770. Armed bands of Penns tried repeatedly to expel the Yankee settlers, to no avail. As tensions rose between the two groups of people, Pennsylvania Governor John Penn attempted to negotiate with Connecticut Governor William Pitkin, also to no avail. It was during this year that the Wyoming Valley was split into 5 regions: Pittston, Plymouth, Nanticoke, Forty Fort, and Wilkes-Barre. When he realized he was losing, John Penn wrote to the British asking for assistance, but the British refused to get involved in what they believed was a mere property dispute. After just a few months of peace, tensions began rising again in 1771 when King Charles III confirmed Connecticut's claim on the land. Despite protests from the Penns, more and more Yankees began settling into the region. In January of 1774, Yankee Governor Jonathan Trumbull officially annexed the Wyoming Valley and prohibited further settlement without the government's authority. Although John Penn wrote the British government, again, politicians set the matter aside as the Sons of Liberty, disguised as Native Americans, had dumped tea into the Boston Harbor, kicking off the Revolutionary War. Officially. Connecticut took advantage of the chaos and pushed the state's boundary line all the way across modern-day Pennsylvania. Connecticut then tried to negotiate by allowing Pennamites to live within the borders, but only if they swore an oath to Connecticut, which would force them to recognize Connecticut's control of the land. A Northumberland County judge, William Plunkett, and a sheriff, William Skull, formed a militia to expel the Yankees from their land when the Yankees used their Susquehanna Company to suppress Penn, quote-unquote, Tories. Both sides wrote Congress asking for protection, but Congress, in the midst of the Revolutionary War, told them to cool it. Neither side listened. Using towns it had founded in areas outside Yankee control, Pennsylvania raised an army of 700 men. On December 15, 1775, they set out from Fort Augusta in Sunbury and marched toward Wilkes-Barre. Although Congress found out and ordered the states to stand down, no one told the men already en route. On Christmas Eve, 1775, Plunkett and his militia landed here at the Nanticoke Falls. They then marched north, up the river, toward the Yankee encampment. Despite the heavy winter conditions that forced the force to stop at the falls, Plunkett's men attempted to trudge up a steep hill in a heavily wooded area to reach the Yankee settlement at the top. But, commanded by Zebulon Butler and Lazarus Stewart, the small group of Yankees used the rocks on the hill for protection and held off the Pennamites. Fearing for his life, Plunkett escaped by going over the falls in a boat as the rest of his forces retreated and fled over the Susquehanna for safety. This became known as the Battle of Rampart Rocks, and Pennsylvania was now 0-2. The Third Pennamite-Yankee War took place in the courts. After the Revolutionary War, Congress overturned King Charles III's ruling and upheld Pennsylvania's claim to the land in 1782, which makes this the only interstate dispute settled under the Articles of Confederation. But Pennsylvanians still wanted to force out Connecticut, and in 1784, both Connecticut and Vermont sent men to help protect the settlers. The whole thing though, fizzled out in 1788 when the Pennsylvania legislature affirmed various land titles. And the conflict officially ended in 1799 when the Wyoming Valley once again became part of Pennsylvania, and all of the Connecticut settlers became Pennsylvanians.